It used to be that all politics was local. Now all politics is social. Next on Global Perspectives, we'll talk about how that has affected the process of political campaigns.
This program is made possible, in part, by funding from the UCF Global Perspectives Office, the Global Connections Foundation, and the India Center at UCF.
This is Global Perspectives with Pulitzer Prize-winning commentator John Bercia.
Welcome to Global Perspectives. What do 9/11, Hurricane Katrina, and the Arab Spring all have in common? They are crises that presented amazing challenges to American political leaders in their time. Our guest today has served as an advisor to political figures such as George W. Bush and numerous Republican presidential campaigns. Doug McMarland shares an insider's perspective on Washington's reactions to these events and offers lessons for future leaders. Hello, Mr. McMarland. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, John.
Tell us about how you got into the whole business of political strategies.
That was actually very interesting. I think that most of us who do get into this get into it either because as our parents were involved or we get into it very young. My parents were politically active. They were certainly not a political family. And honestly, I began volunteering when I was in high school for a local county commissioner that had been appointed by President Reagan to the National Highway Transportation Safety Board. And throughout that, I said, do you think I could get an interview from my school newspaper with a member of the White House staff? And he made a phone call, I made arrangements, and so I was able to sit down with a member of the Intergovernment Affairs team in the Reagan White House, which for me was absolutely fascinating, and I kind of got the bug right there. Also, my dad had run for school board when I was very, very young, so I kind of got to see the process. And basically, I hear from so many people, how do you get involved? And the best piece of advice I can offer anybody is volunteer. And that's what I did. And I volunteered to work in the Ohio Senate during college. And I also then volunteered on a variety of campaigns, beginning with George H.W. Bush's campaign in 1988.
So you got the bug to work on the strategy side. Do you ever have the impulse to move over into running for office yourself?
I honestly don't. I think it's so fascinating what we do on the strategy side and the image side and being able to convey a candidate's message that, frankly, I enjoy that work so much that I've never thought about crossing over and actually becoming the candidate.
Well, let's talk about some of these issues that involve such intense decision-making, issues that are global but have ramifications for us here in the United States, here at home. And we mentioned the Arab Spring, we mentioned Katrina, we mentioned 9/11. These are big events that everybody can relate to, and yet the decision-making process is something that the average person doesn't see. How do you approach these kinds of issues? They're so big, and you don't want to say the wrong thing.
Right, absolutely. And oftentimes we're dealing with what is it that the candidate, or in this case the president, would like to convey. And obviously the policy decisions are made based on a great deal of information, and those are made with the president's gut and based on that information. What our job is, and for example, you take something like the Arab Spring, for example, and the complexity of the information available to all of us right now and the way it actually happens is so extraordinary. You have a situation happen in Egypt with Hosni Mubarak. And basically, I think one of the biggest aspects of this is they're happening in ways that they didn't used to happen. Normally, you would have, typically a revolution and something like that. This, we're being able to see social media, for example, leading up to these particular things. So there's a great deal of information floating out there long ahead of it. And I think it was Tip O'Neill that said all politics is local, and I think that we should readjust that now to all politics is social. And the decision-making process is once that decision is made, there's such a vast amount of information available to a leader to make that. It's a matter of then how's that decision implemented in the appropriate way to convey what the proper message is. And I think that therein lies the crux.
And what happens with an event such as the Arab Spring that is open-ended, is so uncertain, and there really are no experts because we've never seen this kind of thing before. You have experts on the Middle East and on the systems in specific countries, but we've never seen anything on the scale happening in that region.
No, and I remember, many, many years ago when it was always thought, well, the Middle East is eventually going to erupt. Well, eventually it did, and you're right, there are experts all over the place on it. However, it's still going on. Syria is still part of the Arab Spring issue. And with the change with Hosni Mubarak, with Muammar Gaddafi, nobody knew what to expect there. I think what goes into this is not just the decision part on the United States side, but also the decisions that are being made there. Do we think it was wise to, hold out the way Gaddafi did? Do we think it was wise that Mubarak did what he did? Or in this case, too, you could throw in Saddam Hussein. I mean, the decision-making process, and one of the aspects that I think absolutely critical, and why people like me do what we do from a strategy, advance, and image perspective, is that if the character of the leader is such that they're making the decisions for the right reasons, and those right reasons are for the people of their country, or even for their locality, then it's very much easier to convey what those decisions are. And I think we could all agree that a vast amount of mistakes were made in the Middle East during this tumultuous time, and the results have been not only violent, but certainly changing. And are we sure that what's happened as a result of the decisions is really what we want to have over there? And not that it's our choice, but is it absolutely best for the people of those countries?
And also the political figures you're talking about are competing with all of these other voices who are trying to explain it, and some of them are doing it for opportunistic reasons. The Arab Spring was, as we were just saying, and it remains very much uncertain in terms of its direction, but you had people opining on this as if they knew exactly what was going to happen. And similarly with 9/11, the number of bona fide terrorism, counterterrorism specialists before 9/11 was relatively small. Afterwards, you had a cacophony of voices.
Everybody knew afterwards.
Everybody knew.
Yeah.
So that, as somebody who's on the receiving end of these statements, is very confusing.
And what we had was also, you take 9/11 for example, and I don't think that anybody expected what was going to happen. You had President Bush in Florida, and then the horrible tragedy of that day, and there was the visceral feeling in the United States that we wanted something to happen and a decision had to be made. I think President Bush was brilliant in his ability to encapsulate in those short few words on the rubble in New York a few days later exactly what was going to happen, and the people were going to hear from us that tore these buildings down, and they did. And I think that what we want as a country, and even from a global perspective, is to understand the decisions our leaders make in a concise way and see them implemented in a way that brings us as citizens the things that we expect. In this case, national safety, which he did an extraordinary job in that part. And these things, you see the failings on the opposite end of it. And really that goes back to the Arab Spring idea and those leaders, and I can remember, these leaders have been there since I was in college, and now all of a sudden you've had this whole shift change, and what's really going to happen there?
Is it your sense that the issues are growing more complex, perhaps as a result of the fact that our world is figuratively shrinking and becoming more interdependent, and so many of these things that are happening haven't happened before? What does that do to the decision-making process, and what is your responsibility as an advisor in this kind of setting? How do you step up and meet the new challenge?
Is it becoming more complex? No, but are we able to know more of the complexity? Yes, and I think that's largely the result of the 24-hour news cycle, social media, and we'll just take social media as a big umbrella for everything from Twitter to Facebook to blogs and everything else, is we're finding out things. Well, for example, during the bin Laden raid, we were finding out things from a Twitter account of what was actually happening on the ground. So is it more complex? No. Is it more available? Yes. And I think that one of the things that we do on really anything, if you've got a candidate or a particular client that's going to be going into a particular news setting or is going to be out in an environment, to try and keep up with the information flow is really one of the biggest challenges, to make sure that you're always providing as much information as you possibly can, because odds are by the time you hand over the information, there's a lot more that's already happened for it, and it has to be a constant flow of it. And so I think complex, yes, but complex from the standpoint of we know a great deal more and hear a great deal more.
So you're aiming to provide an informed perspective on whatever the issue is at that particular stage, with the option to come back later and contribute more to the discussion as information becomes available. So you're not really looking for a definitive statement.
I don't think there are definitive statements. I mean, and that's the interesting thing. And our political leaders are assisted by a great many people, brilliant people that are national security advisors, and just phenomenal people I've had the chance to work with. So many times what happens is the information comes in, there's a decision made, and then it's how do you convey that decision? How can you convey that either this is the right decision, things are going to be all right. Also, too, how do you convey it in a way that really touches the national spectrum so that you and I as citizens understand what's actually occurring and know what our government's doing, or our leaders doing, or our candidates doing.
And I guess part of this is if you don't have access to all of the information and it is evolving, you may be making a decision at a given point that is appropriate for that point. But as time goes by, it's going to have to evolve because the situation may require additional decision making or different decision making.
Right.
How do you deal with that ongoing challenge?
I guess with the ongoing challenge of that, I mean, and the fact is, for example, you can take, let's take President Reagan, for example, the arms for hostages, the Iran-Contra. The president went on national television and said that this did not happen. Unfortunately, he didn't have the information at that point in time, and then went on and did what a true leader does, which is correct the information and let people know. For example, when we talked about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, and that was adjusted as well. I think that taking a responsibility, our elected leaders and the people that surround them are not omnipotent in knowing what's actually happening. And I think when you get the character of the leader that allows them to say, okay, based upon this decision, here's what I'm going to do. The famous George H.W. Bush, read my lips, no new taxes. Yes, he said it in the campaign. He campaigned on it, but when it came time to make the actual presidential decision, did he do the right thing? And the answer to that question is yes, from the standpoint that from the economy, the results of what he did and what President Reagan did and President Clinton did resulted in a phenomenal boom for the country. Now, he could have just said, you know what, I said I'm not going to do any taxes and not make that decision, but he chose to make it, and I think that shows integrity. Because it wasn't what's going to be was best for him, and ultimately it was one of the items pointed to in 1992.
How do you prepare for your typical day? Since part of this is not knowing what's going to erupt in X part of the world, but do you background yourself generally as much as possible on the whole?
Spend a lot of time reading, and a lot of what we do is, these decisions have been made. And for example, the work that I did during the Bush administration, we were certainly uncompensated folks that were out there trying to build these events and convey a message. We had a phenomenal team in the communications office, and you'd notice during the Bush administration there'd be banner after banner behind. You always knew what the president was talking about, whether it was the economy, whether it was jobs, really any particular topic. So a typical day, there really isn't one, and we would go specifically, for a week straight on one particular issue, with the idea of then conveying it that following week when the president arrived, and his advisors and everyone were there. So I guess there is no typical day. I spend a lot of time reading newspapers. I spend a lot of time reading, posts that come up on the web about new articles and issues as they're happening, just to try and keep myself very well informed.
Do you ever feel that you don't have enough information and you just have to pull back and study for a while, even though that's almost always impossible in this?
No, absolutely. I mean, I think that when you get somebody in an interview or in really anything that says, you know what, I need to find out more about that, I'd much rather have that answer and give that answer than say, well, I think this is going to happen, because you really don't know.
But at the same time, when something dramatic, significant is occurring, there's a lot of pressure on the political leaders to come out and say something.
Yeah, I think it's critical to always have the correct information, and I think that you've got so many great people around a president or a candidate that are providing this information on a daily basis. Then you have people in my position that are out there trying to actually assure that information is provided to the public in the best way possible. And oftentimes, the best way to do that is through actually interacting with the public, whether the president does or a candidate does, and being able to talk about and say, here's what we're doing, here's why it's important, here's how it impacts your life. That was my responsibility there. So on the information aspect of it, we try and make it a point to always provide what we know as we know it and never give the wrong answer. And if we can't know the right information, say we don't have the right information yet. And I think that the real thing here is the people who are important aren't people like me. The people who are important are the candidates and the political leaders themselves, and they're there for a reason. They're there because they've got in their gut how they're going to manage a situation, and based on the information that they can get. But I think we're kidding ourselves to think that they're responding only to the information they're getting. They've got a moral compass inside about how they want to lead, and that's what I think separates them, the best of them, from just advisors.
And the average American citizen has a special interest in the president because it's the only political office that everyone feels he or she has some say in, and they want to be communicated to directly. And
Right.
so, what is the best way to ensure that there is that bridge between the two?
The best way is to provide a venue that allows all of us to get out of the way and allow, in this case, a president to interact directly with people who have come to see him, or in the future case, her, speak about what that particular item is. And I think that what I see as, as the guy walking around in the crowd making sure everything's going well, is that people care very deeply about why they're there, the particular issue that they're after. And of course, there's protesters in there too, and they care just as much. They're there because they want to convey a point. And I think, that it's very obvious to the leader themselves where a crowd is, and you understand really what's critically important. And I think that alters their take. There's, as I mentioned, national security advisors and others that are, advising the president directly. And then there's people like me who are out there trying to convey this and provide that connection to just regular American citizens, like ourselves. And being able to provide that, I think, is allowing the American people to let the president know, or the candidate know, exactly how they feel about a particular issue.
Can you give us an example of an experience you had where you were successful in creating that bridge and you felt that you had really served the interests of both the president and the audience?
Sure. I think that the president signed the No Child Left Behind bill in a small town in Ohio near Cincinnati. Now, interestingly, there had been a massive debate about No Child Left Behind. I'm not here to speak about the merits or non-merits of that particular piece of legislation. It was a hallmark piece at that particular time. One of the things that happens with the bill signing is that you work very hard with the leadership that we work with at the White House to convey that message on the ground. And the communications involved, senior advisors are involved, and then we really put into practice what they would like to have occur. In this instance, we went to a small school. The bill was signed with Senator Kennedy, John Boehner, a variety of others, and what that did was convey exactly what the bill was doing, but conveyed it in an image. In the Obama administration, it was one of their earlier bill signings, and I believe it was regarding the stimulus. And they made a lot of noise about going out to Colorado and signing this bill. Well, they signed the bill in front of a bunch of blue drape and flags. You had no idea that they were in Colorado or really why they were in Colorado. It became a local news story. So just the difference between the two. And I guess the No Child Left Behind aspect pulled together the entire education leadership of Ohio, teachers, students, everywhere, and then was conveyed around the country because it really was a massive piece of legislation that I think fundamentally changed education in the United States. I know, and again, not everybody agrees with that, but how do you convey the importance of what that thing was? And that was one aspect of what we do.
Let's talk about the substance of presidential campaigns, especially in terms of the foreign policy component. This is an issue that is of particular interest to me and a lot of other people who are immersed in the international realm on a regular basis. How big a piece of a campaign should that issue area be, in your opinion?
In my opinion, it should be a huge piece of it. I mean, if you take a look at the 8 years of the Bush administration, foreign policy was, became the single issue of that administration. And you have domestic policy as well. And I think that what happens in these campaigns is they're so long now, and the primaries are so long, and it's so much, let's go ahead and get at each other, that by the time you get to, well, the conventions now, so we have the Democrat convention and the Republican convention, and then both of them, the candidates, the nominees now, I think need to focus on the foreign policy aspects. Although I think there's some weariness still from the wars, the foreign policy issues of the 8 particular years. And I think there's still some public weariness on that, and I think they may be hesitant to step into it yet. But in my opinion, it should be a very key part of anything that's discussed, because the foreign policy aspect is so far-reaching that we have presidential candidates. For the first time, it's now becoming common to do an international tour. When Barack Obama did that in 2008, and I believe it was in Germany with hundreds of thousands of people, and that was a very unique thing. And I think the questions that we heard were, well, Germans aren't going to vote in Germany for our U.S. president, but then you had this tour. Governor Romney's gone out and done an international tour as well, and I think it's getting into the aspect of it, but it seems as though it's almost becoming commonplace that that's something that is important because the United States' reach across the globe is so huge, and the reach of the globe back into the United States is massive as well. I mean, if you take, who would have thought that Greece would play such an important role in our own economy? It certainly was. It didn't cross my mind for many years.
You also brought up a good point just a few minutes ago. The average person may be weary of the war in Iraq and the war in Afghanistan, and that may be synonymous with foreign affairs. And you may not think about other things because both of those have been so all-consuming and they've affected all of us in one way or another. But how do you move beyond those wars and look at really significant issues, whether they are countries or geographic areas or subjects that will make such an impact on the future of the United States?
Well, sure. I mean, for example, the HIV/AIDS crisis in Africa still exists. There's still famine. There's human trafficking. There's a variety of things that oftentimes I don't think that people just buttonholes. Oh, that's foreign affairs. That's something that's impacting a foreign country. But that, in and of itself, is foreign affairs. I think we need to know what's happening in the globe and what kind of the United States response would be to it if this particular person was to achieve the presidency.
Because so many of these issues, whether we think about them or not, actually do reach out and touch us.
Oh, absolutely.
And could. And not,
have,
and,
yeah.
not in a good way necessarily.
Yeah, exactly. National security is one thing, but also this is a form of security as well.
What would be an issue that you feel would be really, really warranting more attention by any candidate? If you had to pick one, I know there's 101 out there that probably deserve to be in that spot, but if you had to pick one that you think that really deserves more attention.
I think probably the single biggest issue facing all of us right now is and I hate to sound like a broken record on the economy, but it really is. And what's going to happen with the euro? And what's going to happen with the foreign banks? I mean, you're taking a look and you see these headlines in various newspapers about 100% likely of a global recession. You see what's happening in Europe. If the euro breaks up, and that remains to be seen what's going to happen with that. It goes back to that the UK was very smart to stay with their pound sterling, but that impact is going to be so massive to the United States, and we're already in an economic crisis of our own, and I don't know that if it's perceived as much that one impacts the other as much as it does.
So what is there for you after, not necessarily when you stop engaging in political strategies, but when you're not doing that, what is life for you like?
Politics is of interest. Actually, the publishing field is absolutely of interest. One of the unique things that I was able to work on were the rollout of some book tours, and it's interesting in the political arena. You're putting on events, you're doing advance work, and you're around there. And there's been books on what advance is, but essentially, it's as I described. You're making these events happen in a particular way. On the publishing side, I was very fortunate to get into applying some of our political strategies to the publishing aspect of it. So where you're taking, for example, a book and it's going to be a major bestseller, or you think it's going to be a major bestseller, and you're able then to build that almost as a campaign. In politics, people work for votes. In publishing, they work for book sales. And it's very interesting to see the similarity between the two. I mean, and that's thoroughly enjoyable. To my other interests is travel, just from the standpoint, that's what I do for a living too, but I think really the fascinating things are seeing parts of our country that would not normally be on the beaten path, and that's been something that is absolutely incredible. Well, also my dog is of interest. I was interviewed for an event, and they said, if you could change one thing, what would it be? And I said that our dogs would live as long as we do. So.
Great. Well, thank you for joining us today, Mr. McMarlin.
Thank you very much, John.
And thank you. For Global Perspectives, I'm John Bercia. We'll see you next time.
This program is made possible, in part, by funding from the UCF Global Perspectives Office, the Global Connections Foundation, and the India Center at UCF.